Hi, Indra. Good to see you again. So we've agreed to talk for lots of reasons, beyond the fun of it, the love of it, because I think we've both been sensing for a while now something that needs to be spoken about more fully and broadly and deeply, um, but which often gets lost somehow, and it's difficult to even clarify what it is. But it's something to do with the feminine, broadly conceived. It's not feminism as such. It's not men and women as such. It's not about power as such necessarily. It's not about epistemology or knowledge as such. It's not about spirituality as such. But it's somehow all of these things and more converging on the issue of the masculine and the feminine, whether that's even the right frame, but different ways of knowing and different kinds of power coalescing in something that's to some extent gendered, but in ways that we can't always say, because the heat somehow takes over and the light disappears. So we wanted to speak about that because we've been keep coming into that in different ways, noticing that there are lots of online platforms shooting up where men tend to dominate or in some ways foreclose the space through the way that it's structured. Um, and also sensing a moment in the world writ large where, well, we're sort of exhausted spiritually and materially. We're in a moment of inflection and reflection through the COVID crisis, trying to imagine what are the resources we need to renew the world. And some people have this instinct that those resources may be conceptual or emotional or psychological, and they may be somewhat more in places we haven't been looking enough or making use of enough, and that those may be feminine, broadly conceived. But I want you to help me understand what that might mean if I've indeed framed it in the right way. Before we get into that, if you don't mind giving me a little bit of a backstory, just to clarify why it is we come to this discussion and how you locate yourself in relation to it.
Sure, and thanks. It's a good opportunity, and I sense there's a good moment for looking at this. So I'm Indra Adnan, and I'm the co-initiator of the Alternative UK, which some of you may know. Broadly speaking, it's a new political platform, not a political party, that just seeks to address, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And for me, this has always been a question about power and agency. If politics serves systems of agency, to put it very broadly, what is that new system, and what could the new politics be arising from that? And yeah, my background is that, where shall I start? I began as a journalist and worked briefly in the arts, thinking that art was the medium and the message, if you like. I moved into politics a bit later in life, when I got frustrated with many other forms of agency. And maybe that my personal frustration was a bit of a driver in all of this. I've been a Buddhist for 30 years, and I always have to add these days that there are many different kinds of Buddhism, and the kind of Buddhism that I was part of is very much cultural, social, activist kind of Buddhism. We chanted and we went out into places where people were suffering. So very much emphasis on the bodhisattva aspect of being a Buddhist rather than the what some might describe as religious or spiritual aspect of it, although of course all of that's included. I moved, I was very interested always in the connection between the personal, the social, and the global. And where I had gaps in my knowledge or my sense of what matters, I try to fill those gaps. So I worked in international relations for quite a while. I developed an interest and some sort of expertise, I suppose, in soft power and what does soft power mean. And later in life, I became a psychotherapist to understand better what our drives are, and and I have a practice with that as well. And maybe one of the most formative experiences, or maybe the most important job I've ever had, is as a mother. and raising a boy specifically, to me, that was a huge education. Yes, all of that, I hope, brings us up to date. And now we're in this moment. And I see this moment, it's interesting. I'm surrounded by a lot of energy and acceleration and, urgency. But in fact, my personal experience is that this is something that we imagined before. We imagined that this was coming. And really the test and the task is to stay centered and grounded and confident about what we've always been bringing. We've been in a permanent revolution. For me, that's what life is. It's a permanent revolution. So I don't think that brings us up to date, but anyway, there may be some starting points there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
from the aspect or the question of the feminine, I didn't grow up as a feminist. That wasn't my socializing at all. I'm from an Indonesian family, half Dutch, half Indonesian. So I have a Catholic and Muslim background, a mixture of those two things, which might be why I became a Buddhist. But my sense of myself as the really challenging thing always for me is that when I describe to people I come from Indonesia, they immediately go into this idea that I come from a culture that doesn't respect women. But my experience was almost exactly the opposite. I didn't question my place in my family until much later, when I emerged into this space where being a professional space, let's put it that way, in this country, living in the UK, where being a woman did make a difference about how you experienced your professional life.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Back to you.
Okay.
It's a long explanation, sorry for that.
Right. So there's two terms there I want to maybe focus in on to begin with. One is soft power and the other is permanent revolution. I'm curious to hear a bit more about both of them and whether there's a connection. But beginning with soft power, my reading of soft power is that it's which I've learned largely from you actually, is that it's but you can tell me how well I've learned it. Is that soft power is the power of attraction, the power of sort of influence through invitation, and it's the kind of power that exists in a sort of ideational space or emotional space or psychological space, rather than through hard power, which is force of money or arms or sort of legislative authority or whatever. So the role of soft power is somehow to make things happen gently somehow. And yet it also has a relationship to hard power, because I think of, for example, the Beijing Olympics, where they put on this extraordinary display in the opening ceremony of precision movements that looked like it was a kind of way of saying we are the new superpower. That's roughly how I mobilize the idea in my mind, but you can tell me how I'm wrong.
Yeah, no. I mean, that's a very good start to the conversation. I mean, if you think about it from the point of view of agency and why I would have been interested. So I did work in the conflict field for a long time. I worked with peace organizations. I ran something called Conflict and Peace Forums, which was like a think tank. And I saw the strengths and limitations of different kinds of conflict resolution, which were sort of zero-sum games. Okay, I'm going to go, I don't want to go too far into either one of these potential rabbit holes. But when I first read about soft power from Joseph Nye, the idea was exactly as you described, as the power of attraction. Within a relationship between two things, there's the possibility of influence. So the action really is to make relationship. And the idea first arrived when America really met its biggest match, which was the fact that it lost the Vietnam War for all intents and purposes. So this was the greatest country in the world, the only superpower really, losing against one of the smallest. How did that happen? They had to really think about, and it really challenged their sense of dominance in the world. But Joseph Nye came out with a whole new idea, which was America will always be the strongest country in the world because of its soft power. And it described its soft power as the power of attraction. So what constitutes this power of attraction? Ultimately, it's the story that America is able to tell about itself. So this to me is the key. Soft power is the power of narrative, actually. What story can you tell about yourself that draws people towards you and wants to make relationship? Right? Now, if we think, the only thing I would challenge you on the way you described it is that you said it was softer, in essence, that it was gentler. That's not really the case. Soft power and hard power are both forms of power, and they're mutually inclusive. One has a story about the other. But if you think about, I'll give you an extreme example. If you think about how ISIS, managed to change the game with a few small, short, cheaply made, absolutely horrendous videos, you'll understand what soft power is. Right? Through image and spectacle, you can change the entire game.
Okay.
And that's not gentle.
No.
It can be just as hard as just as feel that has the feeling of hardness and violence almost as much as anything else.
Okay.
And if you think about how story can hijack our emotions, or how story creates trauma, ultimately, if you think about soft power, it's no contest. It's stronger than hard power, and it always has been. So without the story, hard power wouldn't have any traction.
Right. But so I'm wondering if soft then is somewhat of a misnomer. Maybe not. Maybe, I mean, I don't know how deep this goes.
I think this goes.
Well, just because I might remind us of a famous saying in the Tao Te Ching, I think, which is, the soft overcomes the hard, the gentle overcomes the rigid. Everyone knows this to be true, but few can put it into practice. I know that because I quoted it in one of my books once.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I know what it means exactly. Soft power is distinct from narrative power. It's not quite the same thing, but soft power is a broader framing, I guess.
Yeah, I think soft hard just works in the as in the binary, as a binary, soft hard.
Right.
And so once you move into which one do you want to explore, then there's all sorts of new binaries appear.
Right.
But I would say that the power of narrative is the greatest aspect today of soft power.
Okay.
And I always use the scissor paper stones thing. The idea that you can wrap a stone in a piece of paper, and that we're doing that constantly. How we're now talking about what America's doing, and how we're now talking about what China's doing, could possibly subvert the world order. We're in that sort of a moment, and we're repeatedly in those moments. How was Brexit achieved if not through an idea that through doing that we would take back control?
Right.
And the fact that we couldn't really take back control, there is no taking back control, doesn't make any difference. It still had the power to change something that is essentially a hard set of rules and regulations that we thought were set in stone, but clearly weren't.
Okay.
So, but it goes to what we want to talk about a little bit, Jonathan, because sometimes when we think about masculine and feminine, or men and women, we're instantly talking or thinking about soft and hard as, and let me just follow this up slightly, which is women soft, vulnerable, needy, need protecting, men hard, strong, protective, or therefore leading. It has a lot of resonance. But is it really true? And I'm going to ask you this as a man: is it really true that a woman is less powerful than a man? This is something that we find in our most intimate personal relationships, that women can overwhelm men as much as men can overwhelm women, but in quite different ways.
Sure.
Quite different ways, and I think it's worth exploring.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm struggling not to get very personal and talk about my whole life here, but the premise seems right, and I think it's good to recognize that there are multiple forms of power. The hard-soft distinction is useful here too, because, as you say, when people invoke the idea of we need more of the feminine, or we speak about patriarchy and the problems of patriarchy. There's often this notion that somehow the drive for control, for dominance, for status, the function of volition that moves things forward is an inherently sort of masculine trait manifest in men. And that's not my experience. My experience is a great deal of what happens and that sort of recreates the world, the patterns of social reproduction, the patterns of care and attention and relationship that bring the world into being every day are not from that willful place. They're coming from somewhere else. And in my experience, they arise mostly from women. Mm. But so before we say any of this, we should probably just have, the controlled explosion, which is and by that I mean, to talk about the subject, one has to make enormous generalizations. Mm. And it's difficult to get anywhere without feeling that what you're about to say has several different caveats and qualifications. So I guess we just forgive each other at the outset to some extent, for moments where we necessarily have to speak of men in general and women in general, recognizing, of course, that the differences between men are as great, if not greater, than the differences between men and women.
Yeah. And can I add to that, that I would ask forgiveness right now from any woman who can't see herself in what I'm saying. Every one of us has a different trajectory. I'm probably older than a lot of the women listening. And so, I have the benefit of hindsight, how I spent my life, but also I grew up at a different time. Mm-hmm. So I don't pretend to speak for all women at all. Oh. But I do think that you and I even so could have a fruitful conversation to look at, we create an entry point into the question at least. Yeah. Right.
So with that in mind, what can we say of the relationship between the male-female binary on the one hand and the feminine-masculine on the other? Because I know that's, my sense of that is that we elide between the two quite often. We know they're different analytically, but somehow the question of the feminine principle collapses into the number of women in any given group or on any given stage. And the question of, problems of the masculine or whatever can lapse quite quickly into the critique of some broader notion of patriarchy, which is then reinforced in a given instance by one or two guys in some random group. And so I guess the whole area is awash with this kind of noise and confusion, and yet it feels like there's something very precious to be discovered at the heart of it. I don't know how you progress with it.
Where everything ties up for me is in the notion of development. So although my spiritual way of being is that everything is in the moment. For me, to be human is to live through time, right? So it's really a question of looking back and then looking forward. Mm-hmm. And looking back, it's a history of women traditionally over centuries exploring their power within the private domain.
Right.
So whether that's the domestic or the internal, that's where we've had, I would say, the space and in some cases the luxury to understand human relationship, the necessity and the value of care and so on. Whereas men have been working more in the public space, the public domain. Mm-hmm. And some of that is the origin of their trauma, in my view. Mm-hmm. But also it's why the world is the way it is, right? So the one thing that we can't ignore is that men have built the public space and that the outcomes for our societies have arisen from the way that public space has been built. And that over the last few decades, you know, in very drabby ways, women have been moving into the public space and trying to change the way our, you know, trying to change the outcomes. But because it's been very, you know, just in small, you know, in small ways that women have been able to enter into the public space, they've had to adapt to the masculine cultures, and in some cases have become masculine actors that has confirmed the public space the way it is. What I see as revolutionary, for me, the revolutionary aspect has been the birth of the internet, and how, you know, now billions of people literally are moving into some sort of new knowledge and understanding, not only of themselves but of each other. And we have been in this explosive moment for about 20 years. And that's a little plug for my book, The Politics of Waking Up, which I didn't mention at the beginning. This is the moment of mass waking up, and how we organize the waking people ourselves, how we self-organize, is the new politics in my view. And into this space flows the old ways of looking at masculine and feminine into huge possibilities of new ways of looking at it, and how we build our societies. Right. So I don't have that sense of blaming men or making women the victims of something. I see it as a history, you know, of domains in which are now changing. And I hope that's useful. It makes it useful for me because I feel a lot of compassion, I have to say, for the male journey. And I also feel understanding for the frustration that women experience moving into the public realm. But I think it's helpful to see it as developmental.
Okay. So developmental partly, but also the public-private distinction is very important. I'm reminded of, I think, Kate Raworth's work on donut economics, where somewhere in there she speaks about the kind of invisible economy, or the aspects of the economy that they don't show up in the statistics, which are things like getting the kids ready for school, doing the laundry, doing the meal planning, arranging the play dates, thinking through the appointments and the scheduling for that. And that those things are not always done by women by any means, but predominantly they are. And they somehow, the way we structure society is that there's a default expectation that that's the case in the private realm. And just as there's a default expectation that somehow the public realm is mostly run by men. Not that it should be, but it sort of has been, and so forth. Give me 1 second, Indra. I'm getting one of my children's knocking at the door as we speak.
That's an illustration.
Stay online, 1 second. Sorry, but I can't take it. Vishnu, I'm busy. Sorry. Come on, say hello quickly. Come on. Okay, we'll bring in. I wasn't planning this, but he came in. Okay, he's hiding, but he came to spray me with his water pistol. But we're gonna have to do that later. Okay, I'll see you later on. Yeah. Vishnu, really, I've got to. You gotta keep quiet. Please, I want to call. Okay, so intermission. Yeah, the public-private distinction I find useful, because I think some of what you've been saying to me in the past is that the rebalancing in question is not just, as we often imagine, that we get lots more women into politics and lots more women into senior positions in business, and somehow the public realm is transformed as a result. It's more like that may be part of it, but there's also this twin turn in the private space where men find their administrative, emotional, psychological bearings in a more domestic setting, and maybe even a neighborhood and civic setting, and that somehow we often speak of one but not the other. And it's almost like you've even mentioned in the past about, in terms of giving space, as if just as men have to set aside their promotions and their plans because they can't take all those places in the public realm. Likewise, there's a role to be played in the more domestic or localized realm, where school governors and primary teachers and social workers and nurses and parents, men have to find more of a sort of locus in that world too. And yet, while I say all that, I'm conscious that that's not a static platform, right?
Yeah,
That
exactly.
relationship is constantly changing. And I think that's what you were alluding to by the permanent revolution, in a sense, in that we're now in a situation where those divides between public and private are very much moot and in question.
Mm.
Maybe that's where you see the opportunity for
Yeah. I mean, I always felt a bit of frustration with the old politics that could only see the switches happening within a society that more or less stays static. So women, paying for childcare rather than the working week changing completely.
Right.
Or talking about the economy in which I don't know, different kinds of businesses, rather than a completely new economy arising, such as Kate Raworth is a good starting point, but Rianne Eisler, Eleanor Ostrom, there's so many female economists who've foreseen the effect of women moving into the public space and bringing their values with them. The only thing is that I don't think any of the visionaries really understood how long it would take to bring these new ideas and to have them heard. And I have to say that's my experience too, that I think about the kind of politics that we might be championing as very radical, and yet they're heard as just gentle adjustments, towards something that's more community orientated, or I don't know. I can see that the hearing for what might be quite radical isn't really there. In the same way as we were discussing before about this idea that everything feminine is just softer, but also somehow weaker. And that's the shift I feel right now we might be in the process of making, because if whoever could seize this moment and understand the radical possibilities of this moment, could change everything, really. Tell a new story now about what's possible. Sorry, I flipped into something else again, but for me, this is all necessary right now, is to keep shifting the discussion between the male and female into the present moment and think about it how it appears now.
So it's something. So okay, we've got lots of moving parts here, and also a moving setting. So we've got men and women, masculine, feminine, public, private, soft power, hard power, strength and weakness. But then on top of all that, we have a sort of historical or maybe historiographical moment where we have the sense of flux, particularly digitalization, leading to breakdowns of old forms of communication and power and the sense of what is possible. And in that context, you have questions over refashioning the entire basis of the economy, refashioning the nature of politics as such. And therefore, it's very difficult to make any analytical traction because everything is sort of moving. It feels like everything is fluid. But I guess I want to bring it back then to something you said that made a big impression on me, that we tend to think of the feminine somehow as gentler and nicer and sweeter and kinder. But you made the very astute point that that's sort of not really where it's happening. Where it's happening is a sensibility that orients somewhat more relationally in principle, with all due caveats and exceptions, and is somewhat more care focused and somewhat more embodied, again, as a generality. That inclination and disposition to frame the world differently, what's happening differently, The reason that matters manifests in how things are done, not just in some sort of passive receptacle of values that we can pick and mix from. It's more about the practice and the day-to-day activities. That's where the learning is. Like, see how those values are instantiated, enacted. Can you talk to that a little bit? Because that's what men might, like me, might struggle to understand.
Yeah, and I almost and I feel I just noticed myself, being a little bit overwhelming, sort of like throwing too many things into the space at once. But I'll try to pick up that piece of it, because it does bring it all together, as you're suggesting, which is that, and I'm going to tell a little story here, and I think I've shared this with you before, but it helps. That for about 10 years I ran, or I hosted, let's say, the London Integral Circle in my house. And you came a couple of times, and others that are maybe listening to this were present in that too.
Just say briefly what that was, please.
Which was a sort of a study group, actually, of mostly Ken Wilber's work, but others that were in that, in that group of thinkers. I remember Terry Patton came a couple of times, and many others. And we studied what we thought Ken Wilber was sharing with us, or what he meant, week after week after week. And it was fascinating, and we had a great group of young people in the room, and it was vibey. But around year 6, I remember this very clearly, the women just decided to start a new group just for women. And because they wanted, the question that came up, and I think I was the one who asked it probably loudest, was, so what?
Right.
So what that we understand? So what that Ken meant this, not that? So what? How is this making any impact upon our lives, or upon society as we see it, or upon, poverty or war or whatever? We never even bring those things into the room, right? And so we created this other group, just women, and we moved, and I now retrospectively saw that as moving from the map to the territory. We wanted to, have this knowledge within us, but apply it. We wanted to apply it to the real problems that we met every day. And we started a whole different sort of set of conversations, which quickly caused the men to create a men's group and start to talk about the impact of that. And we were never quite the same again, to be honest. It set up a sort of a tension between us. And I think we arrested, actually, I would say, that whole, we arrested the progress of that circle, and it kind of petered out. And that wasn't my intention, and wasn't our intention, but that is what happened. And I sometimes think that could be happening now in some of the different circles that I'm in.
Right.
But this idea that we act on the territory, I've explored this before with groups within our Emerge community as well. Right. Where I will often ask the question, so what? Or how does this apply? Or where can we build? Where are we actually building something new? What is the building action? And how does this impact upon, in real time, on climate change, or on poverty, or racism, or whatever the issue is that you might see as a political issue? Where are we building the capacity to change that in real time, right? And that comes from a similar, process for me, from moving from the big question of international relations, or the big question of political parties, to, in reality, how do we see it shift now in ways that it has never shifted before?
Yeah.
Right. And, our focus at The Alternative on the ground is because we perceive that real change can happen at that level, but not change which is simply people will get better organized in communities, but it's like a quantum possibility, quantum social change, when people begin to move into relationship with each other in real time. Every time that happens, worlds of possibility arise for those people that were never there for them before. And why does that matter? It's because until now, with the environmental problem as one great way of looking at it, is what has been lacking is A, the political will, and B, the social will.
Mm-hmm.
Our actual willingness to move into action on this has been missing.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're experiencing is that through moving into relationship with people and seeing yourself in this problem,
Mm-hmm.
it releases the will to take action.
Okay.
Right. So
That's
I'm making not
bit.
huge
No,
claims.
I think
Yeah.
it's some profound but subtle point that needs some attention. So, okay, so it's something like this, as I see what you're saying. Rather than begin with the UN climate regime and look at the national governments and the targets they set and whether they meet them and how they measure them and what that means for carbon taxes and yada yada yada. That may be all well and good and maybe part of the story, but ultimately, given the scale of the problem and the urgency of the problem, you need to mobilize people on a massive scale for that, to really have something resembling political hope. But to mobilize, we often think of it as a kind of injunction, thou must act. But I think what you're suggesting is that for people to actually find their own agency in the context of this global problem, they have to experience it in relationship. And that the way that relationship comes about is often through a sort of localized shared concern, or even just a quality of relationship between people, that someone you didn't know before, maybe someone who challenges you, someone who helps you, someone you can help, someone you has a need you notice you can meet. And somehow that action, which is often assumed to be minor in the scale of this massive global wicked problem, may be the heart of the matter. And that actually that's where the hope lies somehow. And just to add a little bit of icing on that sort of conceptual cake, this is what I think you meant when we spoke about this before, and some people in our network are speaking about the North Star, and we have global civilization has to find its North Star and somehow converge on some new telos or vision of how we live together as 8 billion people on a technologically imperious and ecologically compromised planet. But I think what you're suggesting, Indra, is the North Star is not in the sky. It's kind of in the manger, but the manger today is not a child in Bethlehem. The manger today is something more like people in communities with real needs finding each other, and thereby finding political agency, which has generative potential to change society at scale. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. And you have to, I can imagine immediately people turning off and saying, so, it's happened before, or they would immediately think about other, maybe transition towns, or they'll think about, but what I'm trying to link together is the moment we're in, the revolution we've been in for 20 years, and our agency. Right. So once upon a time, we may not have had this power, right? But in this moment, we do. Because if I connect to another and we're forming bonds of trust and creating, resources together, we can, and creating tools and developing new practices. Now we can share that, right, with people across the world. Right, this is what I call a fractal. This is the fractal aspect of it, right? So that wasn't possible before. Before you'd have this little local thing going on, and it just stayed local.
Right.
Now it's cosmo-local, right? Which means not only are we doing what we are inclined to do, but we're also borrowing from the entire world. I can download blueprints for ventilators. If I have a 3D machine, I can do it here in my town now. I don't need to wait, right? And that's the explosion. That's the sort of quantum part of it.
Right.
It's like shifting from my personal idea of agency into something that spiritual people would recognize as my whole worldview changes.
Okay.
But this is not something that we've really experienced as societies, as global societies yet. but
Right.
we could be beginning to do that. But
Okay, let me
starting, but just to go back to the broader, starting on the territory, right? In other words, doing that in person with another person,
yeah,
in a community, building trust.
yeah.
The profound effects of that, so different from imagining it could happen, or it needs to happen, or it should happen.
Right.
Do you see the difference? It's like
I
a
do,
very different thing. Yeah.
I do see the difference, and I take the point about the scope for this to be much bigger than it has been previously, because of scope for replication on a global scale, and mutual, learning across, network effects that quickly cascade, giving hope. So if you look, I mean, I'm wondering though what exactly we're talking about. If we're speaking about a kind of new capabilities, like how do you build a solar panel on your roof, or how do you get your local council to properly deal with plastics, or something of that nature, like fairly technical capability question. But we're also dealing with issues of like emotional and psychological regulation of how do we make sense of who we are today, given that we all feel relatively powerless, and yet we're not powerless, but we have to find the patterns of agency that can be multiplied in the right way for that power to mean something.
So if we continue along the theme of, separation versus relationship, right? So if we think about ourselves as alone, somewhat alienated, possibly, only with a group of friends that are our friends, then only very little is possible. If we think about ourselves as moving into containers of trust, right? So, this is the new, it's a currency,
right?
It's a new form of currency. But how do we create these containers of trust beyond our own families? This is where I would bring women in very much into the picture. It's the skills to be able to do that, noticing what's needed, having the instinct to include, how a family comes together, for example, is a very skilled task. I'm not saying that men can't do it. All I'm saying is that historically this has been the skills of women. You have 5 children, each one of them completely different. How do you bring them together as a family? This is not from an integral point of view, it's sort of like teal capability. You let them self-organize, you let them be themselves, and still you manage to bring them together and create some sort of shared identity. These are the things that happen in communities, right? And it's what's been missing. I describe it in civil society or like conversations as the vital social infrastructure that has been missing until now.
Okay.
So we don't think about this anymore as families. We think about them maybe as towns or cities of where these containers of trust could be built now in all these, using all of these new tools, and with all this new language, and that becomes a very powerful political unit. Very, very different from numbers and votes, on a page.
So I'm with you. I just want to slow down to make sure we capture it carefully. I'm reminded of a few things. One is Elinor Ostrom's idea of polycentric governance. That we have multiple levels of political structures, that we need that somehow. And that deals with problems of centralization, excessive centralization, and also excessive bureaucratization, which erodes trust. And it gets beyond maybe the naive vision of a universal government, but it allows for patterns of connection across countries rather than just within them. The second thing that came to mind was the relatively new, maybe it's not that new, but it's new to me, notion of a global civil society. In some ways, it's as old as the hills, but it gets this notion of people collaborating and coordinating across countries in the kind of units you're alluding to. And the political hope may be invested in global civil society, by which I mean, it's not about electing the right governments in about 200 countries of the world. It's something more about the qualities of human beings that are mobilizing in the right way at a local and regional level, starting often on a street by street, house by house, person by person level. And that somehow what you're intuiting, I think, is there's a potential multiplier effect here that we need to attend to, which is something to do with the capacity to learn from each other at scale relatively quickly, if we learn the practice properly. So that's how I'm seeing what you're saying, but also the unit of trust notion is quite fundamental, because I believe on many measures, lots of countries have seen social trust eroded in recent years. Trust in government is certainly very low. As a result of COVID, trust in markets might become lower as well. Like, but trust in people seems to be a source of hope, because as we begin to help each other and realize we're in it together, we feel that viscerally. This is kind of back to what we're meant to be. So I guess I'm just trying to get it, because we've taken a long way round to the feminine, but maybe very helpfully so, because in some ways we're getting into this issue of the nature of relationship, the nature of trust, the nature of power, the connection between the local and the global, or the glocal, the cosmo-local, you call it. Actually, stay with that. Just if I could ask you a question on the back of all this. The cosmo-local, what's the connection between the feminine and the cosmo-local? There's a sort of tangible question for you.
Yeah, that's a nice small question. I mean, I'm not going to give you any easy answer. It's just the, and even as I'm listening to your questions, I'm asking myself, how did I always relate to these different realms of being differently from the way that Jonathan's asking me this question, right? So I think it's natural to the feminine to think of everything being interrelated and organic, and not separated out into categories. I think we're obliged to become, to create categories when we move into the public space, but I think it's quite natural to intuitively respond to things, believing that everything is connected, right? So I know that's a huge claim, but that's my experience of working with women, that I don't need to explain everything. When I make a leap from one thing to another, there's a sort of, we can move there quickly, intuitively together. Therefore, the oneness, if you like, of the personal, the social, and the global, if you're allowed to talk, from the heart, for example, you're allowed to talk personally, you quickly reveal that you're, that you're seeing them as connected, right? The way I look at the world, the way I look at society comes from myself, the way I look at myself. And so these three realms are one. How you're seeing one is affecting how you're seeing the other. From a more public space orientation, I would look at I would look at the personal, the local, the global as things that need to be brought into alignment, right? So you talked about the change in global civil society. I would say, as I change, it changes. And in fact, I see that civil society is in the same revolution as a community. So a community sense of itself is happening as the global civil society sense of itself is also changing. So, for example, the NGO community, has been under a lot, it's been under a lot of fire over the last couple of decades, because it's very dependent on a funding system, which is the old economy. So it's kind of, it's been, it's part of the old problem, but it's changing itself as everything changes. And that's what I would expect to happen. I don't know if that's a more feminine way of looking at possibility, but I don't think immediately I need to fix it all. I see it all as evolving, and I can see the relationship between what's evolving here and what's evolving there. It makes sense to me in a different way. And when I talk like this, I'm very conscious that if I've tried to make these sorts of claims with other men, even my own partner possibly, I'll sometimes get a shut down. I'll be told, yeah, that's all very well, or that's a bit fluffy, or that's it. But in fact, it's based on a felt and lived experience that the three realms of the personal, the social, and the global are not three different realms. They're all within the self, and that we're affecting them all, and that cascading notion that you described happens naturally, and it's an evolutionary principle. But the fact that I expect it to happen is part of how I appear differently in the public space than maybe a man would.
Okay.
So,
So
yeah, I'm interested to see how you would respond to that.
I feel like, if I'm honest, that there's a gap between what I'm sensing intellectually and what I'm feeling emotionally. So the part of me that feels the same kind of interconnection that you feel resonates with the idea that they're of a piece, and that on any given day we experience them more or less. So for example, during the COVID crisis, the global, the local, and the personal are clearly inextricably linked. And I think it's not difficult for people to imagine that. It also helps people to feel it and see it. And after this, that may be a collateral benefit of what we're going through. At an intellectual level, I'm reminded of the conversation we had comparing your view of my sense of your view of social and political change, which is grounded in relationship and a certain degree of sort of spiritual insight that arises from the relationship, with something more like the Montpellier Society view, in which you invite the great and the good to a castle. Well, I'm not sure if it was a castle, but you from the world. And I think you get the best journalists of the day and the biggest politicians of the day and the opinion formers, and you get them all together and you create a grand narrative. And then in those days, the grand narrative was about the coercive power of the state and the problematics of the state and the relative value of the market in allocating goods and services to people more intelligently. And it was grounded in the work of Hayek, especially, but many others, Friedman and so forth. And they tell the story, and they ask their army, if you like, to keep telling the story and make that the new reality, right? So, and that was then. And I think one of the things you've said to me, and I'm conscious of now, is that the Montpellieran strategy can never happen again, because we don't control the narrative in the same way. So I'm coming back to soft power now, and I'm thinking of everything we've spoken about. And yes, we need, it appears we need a new narrative. And actually I get a bit tired, if I'm honest, of people saying that, because I don't quite know what it means in the world as we find it. I see it in principle, but again, there's an issue of constants and variables, what's moving and what's not. And the idea that we could control a narrative today and say, this is the new social imaginary, who we are, guys, even if it was hyper sophisticated, in all, recognizing all the epistemological, geographic, political variations and complexity built into the best integral map in the world, then rendered into sound bites and forms of memes and images, and that became our, even then I don't somehow buy it. And partly I don't buy it because I think a few different things. One is it seems a bit disembedded, disembodied. And the other is it doesn't really take into account that resistance and contest are not wrinkles to be ironed out. They're sort of they're an inherent part of the world as we find it, and sort of always will be. and maybe that's not such a bad thing either. You know, that form of resistance and challenge is what keeps us awake to life. So that's a long way of saying that I do sense why the heart of the matter, one of the main active ingredients, if not the most generative one, lies in the hearts and minds of people and their immediate relationships and their capacity to find agency in their local world. And I can also see why that's a somewhat more feminine orientation to a global conundrum. Because I think the more male way of looking at the global conundrum is something like understand all the parts, find the right lever, even if it's a narrative lever, which is a weird notion, but yeah. And somehow pull it really hard and like hope that somehow everything comes
exactly.
And I know that's not right, but I just I also know that I can see why people would also be a bit skeptical of starting in places you've been in, Plymouth and I forget where else right now, but very
Stoke and Birmingham.
Okay. So
London.
There are, all these other places, and saying, look, work with people where they are. So I guess my question then for you is, it's not either or, right? It's clearly both and. So it's not like you stop trying to elect more capable government.
So I agree with you in terms of the narrative, which is funny because somewhere people will remember that even in this conversation I talked about soft power.
Yeah.
But it's how you are with soft power that's the issue. And when I hear people saying we need a new narrative, I think, you've missed the point.
Right.
Because you're trying to now pick up a narrative and use it as a weapon.
Right. That's not a narrative, right?
That's not a narrative. A narrative arises from within.
Right.
So right now, you're telling a story about yourself and you're telling a story about me. I have no access to that, but you're telling it anyway, right? And I'm doing the same.
Right.
It's the new narrative becomes, rises to the surface when enough people are feeling something very similar, right? And then that becomes a new narrative. And for us, the search for a narrative at all is one that will help us move forward towards our goals. But it has to arise from a realization on the inside. The moment you're telling a new story about yourself, or this is one of the things I've experienced in different ways with Extinction Rebellion, for example, which started off. Well, and forgive me now, any Extinction Rebellion people listening, because this is just my story, right? We started out as a protest, and it grabbed the headlines, and it told a new story, and Greta Thunberg's done the same. So present somewhere is a new story of what is going on.
Right.
But it didn't necessarily serve at the revolutionary level that we were talking about, because it was a story of protest. What's happened since then in a group that I'm involved with called the Future Democracy Hub, it's part of Extinction Rebellion. They've been working now determinedly in communities. It's now called Community Transformation Group, right? They've moved into a new way of being agentic, instead of harnessing everything under a protest banner, they're now working with others, trying to help them do whatever it is that they do to make them feel better and stronger and create these new. So they're using their convening powers to build new spaces of trust. And pennies are just dropping on the inside. I see it, I'm watching it. And it's this pennies dropping thing where somebody suddenly really sees another person, right? And really that person suddenly sees that they feel the attention and they can feel their own power coming alive. It's like a flame gets lit. And that flame getting lit is the thing that we're talking about. When people start to feel their own power and they start to organize themselves, even just working at a local level is enough for them, because they're seeing their environment change, right? So in very practical terms, we've had the tools for ages, right? So the tools are all there: transition towns, permaculture. We could easily become a nation of people becoming resilient. But at the moment, in the way of becoming resilient, they're also finding belonging and meaning and purpose by being with each other. So we have all sorts of social issues and mental health problems or whatever are being addressed in the same moment, right? So it's not a fix. It's not a thing that you can fix from up here somewhere. It's a thing that has so much more power when people are realizing it for themselves and experiencing it real time. And then you're reading about this, right? So Transition Networks, for example, has a global presence. It has a global network. It's now moving into relationship with networks of commoners. I don't know if you know the commoning principles and peer-to-peer networks, and now getting this extra energy from Extinction Rebellion spaces. I mean, what I'm seeing is rapid acceleration of these spaces of trust and people moving into relationship with each other, real time.
Okay.
And through one person moving into relationship with another. Now, if you're looking at it from the old politics point of view and you're talking about neoliberalism, I would say the one achievement of neoliberalism and the Mont Pelerin, effect, if you like, was disconnection. How to disconnect people and make them into effective consumers. That was the effect. The revolutionary effect is to undo that and build it from another place. That's the way that I've always seen it. The other part of it, Johnathan, is that even the Mont Pelerin actors will at some point understand that whatever they thought they achieved, they also destroyed the planet. They didn't have control over the only one thing that matters, ultimately. And there will be a lot of understanding even amongst those actors and also now in this COVID moment, that they couldn't achieve that either. Through the disconnection of everything, they've released these new potent, actions into our actors, the bacteria, the way the bacteria moves into our world. They must be moving into a space of either humility or desperate. Maybe they're desperate now to overcome their failures by not facing them. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's more to say there. I think I just realized that I called it the Mont Pelier Society instead of the Mont Pelerin. Something quite different, yeah. But yes, the thing I'm left with is trying to bring this back to, we knew that it's not easy to talk about the feminine. Now we have some better sense of why, I think. Because we have spoken about it, but fairly obliquely, for the most part. But there's something where we're ending up now, which is a recognition of the orienting oneself through the body in a particular place in relationship to other embodied agents, with all trying to make sense of the world that they're invested in together, sensing more deeply than ever that world is infused with global influences that feel mostly like they're beyond their control and yet aren't entirely beyond their control. And there's something about coming into relationship with each other in a non-instrumental way, something about really caring for and helping each other find our respective agencies. And then working with that. And because we're now in a digital space where local victories can be celebrated and replicated potentially, that's a source of hope. Now, that's not obviously a feminine issue, but it is caught up in all this stuff about soft power and about the fundamental importance of the relationships and the local and the emotional and psychological active ingredients that make things happen. So there is a sense in which we are speaking about that, even if we're not going at it head on. And that may also be a feminine trait, not to be quite so direct on the issue. So that's where I'm ending up for now. It's obviously just the beginning of a much longer discussion involving many more people, but I'm very grateful to have it underway.
Can I ask a question before you end? And I can see that time-wise we should end. And maybe it just opens up another question. which is what we haven't really looked at is the difference. Meaning, I quite often I see more and more, maybe this is the yin yang aspect, you know, I see more and more men accepting maybe a lot of what I've said and picking up the tools and talking about the feminine and owning the feminine. But we still exist in a world where the men are heard and occupy the public space, continue to do so. So in a way, maybe what I'm saying is I would interview you and ask you why you feel that's still the case. And is there something around, we haven't really honored that the differences between men and women can continue healthily. You know, so there is a male development part of this that we haven't really talked about, and it may not be that it's picking up the female tools. It may be that what we're trying to bring, and I think that certainly in our politics, we're trying to bring more partnership between men and women, rather than that men should be more like women.
Right. So
yeah, that's certainly not my intention, and that's something I think often gets missed from the discussion.
I agree, and I think you put it very well some time ago, where you said that in many of these discussions, people talk around the issue, but the elephant in the room, as you once put it, is that men and women are different, right? However, and this is something I wrote about in my recent book about chess and life, about why it's the case that so many more men than women play chess, and why it appears that men are better, and for the most part. And that's a big discussion with lots of aspects. But perhaps the key line there, and that came initially from reflecting on conversations with you, was, you know, men and women are different, but the nature and meaning and implications of those differences should not be decided by men. In other words, it has to be a collaborative venture. The reason people are terrified of the idea that men and women are different, or that frightens people, it feels coercive, is because of the patterns of power relations for so many years, where that difference meant, therefore you stay at home and look after the kids while I get the job. Rather than, look, we can talk about how we're different. It will be a politicized context. How we frame the terms will matter. But ultimately, we want to get to a place where the differences are meaningful with all due caveats and exceptions, and they're held by both sides in some kind of equilibrium or balance. So that's, I suppose, where you want to get to.
Yeah, and you know, we could start. I mean, I'm grateful to you that you allowed me to share the much bigger vision, you know, of the political vision, if you like, because that's the thing that we rarely get to, right? But not between us, but between men and women. You know, it tends to stay when we have these discussions. I've noticed it online as well, that when we bring the discussion of the men and women, very quickly the men will tell you, and they will still dominate the discussion about how it's impacting them, right? You know, how their emotional lives and how they're feeling, their trauma, and we have yet another conversation in which the men have seized the agenda, you know, which I think to me is what I call a yang propensity. You know, it's the willingness to perform.
Right.
But you've done something different today, but then I worry that because I'm as thoughtful about the impact on men as I am about the impact on women. I feel women have become strong in this private domain and the internal, because they've had to in so many ways. But I see a lot of vulnerability amongst the men too, you know, and I'm bringing up a son, and you know, how to be in the world, how should a man be in the world in this new era? I'd love to skip that whole phase where it becomes defensive, you know, but unfortunately we can't. We can't skip that. We're in it, right? But how do we move fast to the differences and the partnerships between the two? That would be great.
Yeah, well, this is the beginning. So thanks for joining me, and there'll be many more, and with many other people too, I hope. So thanks for getting us started. And
no, thank you.
Talk to you again soon.
All right, Jonathan, thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.